Welcome to our panel discussion on finance and operations. Again, I'm Michele Russo, the Managing Director of Research and Practice at the AIA, and we're finishing the day with the question we first get asked, and that came up several times earlier in the program. And so hopefully we got a group that stuck around to hear about this important topic that, again, comes up time and time again. Each panelist, just structurally, will give a short presentation about their firms and their research journeys, and then we'll spend the rest of the session in discussion, using the questions that we've prepared, as well as addressing as many questions of yours as we can. So please use that chat function to talk amongst yourselves and with our panelists, and the Q&A for questions you want answered. So there's two different windows to work with. Before we get on to the presentations, a few notes. One, I'd like to give a special thanks to our sponsors, Victor, the CNA insurance companies, and the AIA Trust, who are providers of the AIA Trust Professional Liability Insurance Program. As a reminder, we're recording all sessions of this conference. The recordings of the sessions you registered for will be available to you as a conference goer throughout the rest of the year. If you are eligible and would like to receive AIA continuing education credit or a certificate for attending the session, please enter your name, email address, and AIA number. There are 1.5 LUs available for this panel discussion. While we're doing a lot of the talking, we want you to be part of the conversation. And I mentioned this before, but I'm going to emphasize it again. Please share questions you have for the panelists in the Q&A box, and we'll get to many of those as possible. And again, if you have thoughts or comments along the way on the matters we discussed, you can share those in the chat. This is a conversation that we all want to be part of, so we encourage you to join in. And now let's switch over to our panelists. First, we have Colin Booth, who's the Strategic Director of Placetailor, a Boston-based design, build, develop cooperative focused exclusively on passive house and zero emissions workforce housing. With 20 years in design, Colin's experience is in the integrated design process and integrated delivery models necessary for the rapid adoption of more sustainable solutions. We also have Billie Faircloth, a practicing architect, educator, and partner at KieranTimberlake, where she oversees the queries and investigations that begin and inform each project at the firm. During design, she guides project teams through empirical experiments, prototypes, and analysis. She leads the development of technology that informs high-performance design, including Pointillist, a wireless sensor network, Tally, a life cycle assessment application, and Roast, a building occupant comfort survey that I love the name of, sidebar. Billie is currently an adjunct professor of architecture at the University of Pennsylvania Stuart Weitzman School of Design, and has served as the Barbara McMurray Professor at University of Tennessee, Knoxville, and Velux Visiting Professor at the Royal Danish Academy of the Fine Arts. And finally, last but not least, we have Kimberly Seigel from Perkins and Will. After pursuing degrees in environmental studies and environmental management, Kimberly has spent the last 13 years working on interdisciplinary teams tackling some of the built environment's most pressing sustainability challenges, with a particular focus on climate change. As a research knowledge manager for Perkins and Will's research group, she draws upon her background in research and sustainability consulting to help bridge the gap between various practices and the innovation research happening across the firm. And let's begin. Billie, you're up first.
Thank you, Michele.
Of course.
Hello, everyone. Just give me 1 second. Sorry, having some technical difficulty. Michele, are you able to see my screen? Yep.
Yes,
okay.
I can.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. So first, I just want to thank the BSA for inviting me and my firm to talk about practice-based research, especially about this issue of finance and operations. I'm going to share a lot of words and thoughts about this subject. You heard earlier from my colleague, Christopher Connick, and he shared with you many of the projects that we have worked on through our practice-based research model. So the first thing is just who, what, and how. So KieranTimberlake, as Christopher shared, we're around 85 employees. We've been engaging research-based practice for the entire length of our practice for 36 years. Who does our research? We do have a dedicated transdisciplinary team, but our research infrastructure is accessible to our entire staff. Our research is also done through deep collaboration with industry and with academic partners. On a day-by-day basis, research looks like, well, we've got dedicated roles, people who have the title researcher, but it also looks like a process of legitimizing questions, diversifying methods, providing resources, proving concepts, and sharing knowledge. We pay for research internally through our strategic plan, but also through grants and through billable projects. I wanted to share very quickly, a lot of words, no images, some of the things that I've learned in my role as research director over the last decade, more than a decade. I have learned something about building research culture. And I have begun to understand that there are a series of conversations that we have to have internally in our practices between everyone in the practice about what it means to build a research culture. So I have just 7 items that I'd like to share with you. So first and foremost, it's important to identify the questions that are a genuine expression of your firm's design culture and design philosophy. So at KieranTimberlake, our questions are an expression of our culture, and you heard a number of those questions read by Christopher Connick previously when he was talking about a whole range of our projects. And the question mark then is essential KT research infrastructure. We also established research as a project. It's incredibly important. We established research or searching and searching again as a project that requires people, resources, time, collective intelligence, and quality assurance. It's not something that we can do on the weekends or in off hours. We recognize that it requires dedicated resources. We also have committed ourselves to growing a culture of experimentation. So when you're going through and talking about a research program or research process, you have to have that conversation about, are you going to permit people to fail? Are you going to allow for attempts and reattempts at research? Can you commit the resources to maturing feedback loops? Another conversation that we've had that I know many of you have had when you're building your research programs or practice is that we have to identify opportunities for research. This is a primary question that I'm asked quite a bit. Where do research opportunities come from? And I would say that there are many sources. So research opportunities at KieranTimberlake are integral to our design process, and they absolutely tap into an architect's core competency. So for all of our projects, through all phases of design delivery, we can ask a series of questions and use multiple methods to answer those questions. So we might ask questions like, what is the microclimate variation across the site? That requires deep site survey, deployment of sensors, et cetera, to really begin to understand the true microclimate of the site in order to create a design response. We could ask a whole other range of types of questions for any project in any phase, such as what are the embodied environmental impacts of a certain building or a certain component, or what's the relationship between corridor width and population flow? That's a very targeted question, but again, it's a question that could help shape a design action. Research opportunities can also be found within your completed body of work. And here we might be talking about real protocol for things like post-occupancy evaluation. But when we look at our completed body of work, we know that our work is full of hypotheses about how that work should perform to support people and their goals at their institutions. And so we know within our completed body of work, we can ask a whole range of questions. So for instance, Tally, the tool that was talked about earlier, came out of a simple back of the envelope calculation we did for the Loblolly house, which was an offsite constructed house that could be fully disassembled. We simply wanted to know how much embodied carbon we could recover from that house. And that calculation in 2008 was the initial spark for what became an internal process, then what became an external process. Research opportunities can also be found within your firm's commitment to challenges, which are bigger than any one firm or bigger than any one discipline. And we know that there are a whole range of challenges that we are deeply committed to. And those types of challenges can form and inform a research program. The other decision that requires thoughtful attention of your firm is simply how you're going to conduct your research. So one of the things that requires discussion is the kinds of methods that are going to be used. Maturing a platform of techniques and methods, in our experience, has taken many, many, many years. Ours is a multi-method approach. It's afforded by our commitment to transdisciplinarity. But we also have made a commitment to continue to remind ourselves that design practices are not centered on technology, but on people who ask questions and who answer them collectively. And we also know that the other aspect of this is that we have to evolve our research practices. So we have to look for opportunities. We've done this internally. I'm sure you've had these discussions too if you're working on research and practice. Look for opportunities to discuss your research practices internally and discuss and articulate points of disagreement. So you might have points of disagreement about who's actually conducting the research, who are the researchers, what's the interface between design process, and research. There's a whole range of items that could be debated. And finally, we have to acknowledge and have this discussion as well. We have to acknowledge that when we adopt research practices, it's for us not for the sake of providing new services. It's really for the sake of increasing value. And that value comes in the form of new agency for our clients, better outcomes, and new agency for the architect. So finally, in closing, I think there's a whole range of questions that can be debated inside a practice. And I just want to close with this slide. I'm not going to read it point for point, but there's a whole range of things that I know we've said yes to, but we've said yes after having to debate the following questions. So is a practice willing to invest in research by reinvesting its profit to fund the exploration of hunches? Can a practice support the precept that failure teaches and shapes our work, especially when structured inquiry sometimes yields unexpected, disappointing, and inactionable results? And will a practice cultivate research projects that are proactively instigated by strategic aspirations rather than a paying client? Will a practice impart to its staff the agency to ask questions and provide the resources necessary, such as materials, tools, research partners, and leadership to answer them? And will a practice share the products of its research externally when it recognizes that a perceived competitive edge is eclipsed by a greater need for transformation in the profession? And finally, will a practice support an effort to really build a culture of research? Thank you.
Thank you, Billie. Kimberly, can you share your story with us?
Yeah, let me try to share my screen. Hopefully you guys can see it. Let me know if you can. All right, great. So hi everyone, I'm Kimberly Seigel, Research Knowledge Manager at Perkins and Will. And I just want to start by also thanking the BSA for inviting me and Perkins and Will to be a part of today. It's a really exciting day. And I think what I'm about to present is going to echo a lot of the things that Billie just presented, which is great because I think it reinforces there's a lot of similarities amongst these firms that are pursuing research, but with nuances that make them uniquely their own. So with that, I'll get into my presentation. So real quick, just for those of you who are not familiar with Perkins and Will, we're a global firm, global design firm. We've been around for 85 years. There's about 2,400 of us globally. We work in 14 areas of practice across 26 different studios. So quite a large reach, as you can imagine. This is a pretty good visual, just like where in the map we are. And with the firm, with this kind of global reach, you know, each studio maintains their own unique flair, but we're all cut from the same cloth. And so we still connect to the overarching mission of Perkins and Will, our overarching purpose, and research is very integral to everything we do. This sounds cliche, but it's part of our DNA, and so that's kind of pervasive throughout all of our locations. And so how do we do this? You know, we foster a culture of knowledge through our 7, soon to be 8 research labs. We have AIA, which is our 501c3, it's our nonprofit arm. We have our Innovation Incubator program, which I'll briefly describe in another slide, and we also have a research journal. So our 7 research labs, as they stand right now, are design process, human experience, mobility, energy, building technology, resilience, and material performance. And these labs, or these areas of investigation, are dynamic. So we often sunset old labs when we realize that that area of inquiry may have already matured or evolved, and we introduce or bring on new ones that align with where we think our industry is going, and where we think that there's more of an investigation, it requires more information. So housing affordability is going to be our 8th lab, because we recognize there's a need and there's a lot more research that can be done within our field. Our organizational structure also includes officially appointed or dedicated lab leaders for each of these areas, and these are our firm-wide labs, but there's also mechanisms within each of our studios to connect to the broader firm-wide efforts, as well as to host local, more smaller research efforts that are locally relevant. These labs are also our conduit for our connections to industry partners. So we have a lot of academic partnerships with various institutions ranging from Georgia Tech, Cal, University of Oregon, Harvard, MIT, to also industry partnerships. So building transparency was mentioned earlier today. Autodesk Build Space is another partner of ours, and we recognize the power of this collaboration and this partnership. And then much like the overall just, you know, as every lab requires a lab director, the overall vision and direction of research for the firm requires a director. So John Haymaker is our director of research. I'm the research knowledge manager. And then of course, everything that we do is overseen by our research board, which makes sure that we're staying true to our vision. So these items right here are the remaining items of our research ecosystem, so to speak. So the research journal, which is right over here, it's in its 12th year of publication. It's a mechanism for peer review, so it adds a lot of rigor to the research that we're conducting in our firm. It's open access, it's available online. We publish all of our journals online, as well as if you want to order a print version, you can. But the point is, you know, we're not doing the research just to do it. We're doing it to actually inform our industry. It's kind of what Billie had said. In addition to that, as I mentioned, we have a 501c3 arm, which allows us to partner with academic institutions and pursue funding opportunities or grants that might not necessarily be available to us as a for-profit institution, but as a nonprofit, we can go for it. And then our Innovation Incubator program, which this is our new branding. It's pretty exciting. Probably doesn't mean much to those of you who haven't seen the previous branding, but it's very exciting. So a little bit about our Innovation Incubator program. We just celebrated our 10th anniversary. Last week was our internal Innovation Week. And what the Innovation Incubator program is, it's open to anyone in the firm, anyone from new hires, you know, grads to principals can apply. And it's not just for our designers in our firm, it's open to anyone in accounting, HR, it's literally open to anyone. And they're microgrants of funding, either $1,000 reimbursables and 40 hours of time for individuals, or if you're on a team, up to 80 hours and $2,000 reimbursables. And we do 2 calls for applications every year, and once you submit an application, it's evaluated on 3 criteria. How innovative is the proposal, which is always a fun discussion, which the committee has. There's an 8-member committee that evaluates all of these applications. So how innovative is the research that's being proposed? how relevant is it to our overall mission, and is the scope feasible within what's being proposed? And this slide right here is a good snapshot of the past 10 years. You can see it kind of by the numbers down here. We've had close to 700 applications submitted, and we've funded 252. So you can see here, there's an element of competition here within the firm, which always, I think, enhances the level of innovation, to be quite honest, because who doesn't love a little bit of friendly competition? And you'll see here, just based on these thumbnails from the different project submittals, it runs the gamut from any kind of topic. So right here, this is delivering differently for the future. This is looking at autonomous vehicle delivery for curbside delivery. Getting gestural was one that was employing sensor technology to our day-to-day work as architects and designers. This one right here is a native bee pollinator hotel. So some of our landscape architects got a grant and wanted to build an actual pollinator hotel, understanding what materials and different things were attracting pollinators. So you get a sense that it's really anything. And it's a pretty exciting program. I think the fact that it's within our firm, it just, I think it's something that everyone engages with and is really excited about, and it enhances the culture of all of our studios. So this diagram right here is how we envision practice-informed research for research-informed practice. I've also come to learn at my time at Perkins and Will that the word research is synonymous often with challenge, either because the word itself is a little bit intimidating, or people feel that they're not empowered to actually use the tools at their disposal, or perhaps the allocated hours at their disposal. And in addition to that, I think there's been countless conversations that I've been privy to, kind of debating the difference between big R versus little r research. And so this idea of academic research or basic research, as I've heard it being referred to earlier today, and applied research. So there's this preconceived notion that academic research and applied research could be at odds with one another, but I think this also leads to ongoing discussions about how we as an architecture and urban design firm can sync up our practice to answer some of these pressing research questions and really get the topics under investigation. So really quickly, just kind of walking through this diagram, although it's pretty self-explanatory. Over here, you have your research-minded practitioners who are working on a project. They identify a practical problem. And I think before you get to the point of formulating your research question, which is critical, it's probably best to do a quick little investigative query to see what exists and what's out there. And I want to quote something that Andrea Love said earlier today. She had mentioned that, it's best that we're transparent with our research so that we're not answering the same questions just slightly differently. I think it's also really important, don't reinvent the wheel. It's great to know what's already out there and then build upon it. So from that, you can formulate your research question, identify your research methods with our dedicated researchers on staff who are practice-minded. Together, outline your research tasks, hopefully answer your question and validate it, and then contribute that knowledge and in an ideal world, have a practical impact on your client-based work. And then I would also just kind of identify here this funding and sponsored line. It kind of cuts throughout. So we allocate a certain amount of funding of our own kind of overhead to do investigative research, but we also try to seek out other grant opportunities and funding opportunities as well. And so then lastly, I think it's important to reiterate, and I think this is something we talked about on one of our prep calls, there's people behind the research. The research isn't happening on its own, it's being carried out by individuals and by groups of people. And so I think it's sometimes nice to actually remember that there's faces behind that. So this is we've been doing extensive work with the Building Transparency Group on embodied carbon. It's been a really great investigation. This is Hakeem, who was supposed to present right before this, and unfortunately due to technical difficulties couldn't, but this is what he looks like, and that's our robotic arm. The acronym is MRAD, but we also lovingly refer to it as Armando. And this was when so Hakeem and the robotic arm went to Vancouver, our Vancouver studio, to work with some of our designers there. And this is Erica Island, who is a recent hire for this year. She just finished her doctorate at Harvard School of Public Health, and she's been working directly with a lot of our project teams, understanding, aspects of public health and human experience within our project design work. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Colin.
Okay. Oop. All right. Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with you today and with my esteemed presenters now and earlier. I'm Colin. I'm coming to you live from our office of Placetailor here in Roxbury, and I love PBR. I'd like to share with you a little bit about my experience in promoting research over the years in a variety of settings. I'll open with the most critical point. The world needs architects doing practice-based research. It is absolutely imperative that we collectively orient our industry toward this in any way we can, in all the ways we can. The world needs problem solvers who think the way we think and organize the way we organize. And that means the world needs architects who are driving progress through applicable research. So practice-based research is the vehicle for industry transformation. I think everything else follows that. But how do we pay for it? How do we fund all of these world-saving extracurricular efforts? As a design activist, I've been poking at this problem for my entire career. And eventually I reframed the question a little bit. How do we generate more valuable intellectual property? It's not how can the typical architectural service business model pay for extra effort, because that will often conflict with paying rent, but rather it's what is the right model to generate and retain valuable progressive design IP. So framing it in that way leads you down a different path. Before getting into my current practice, I want to touch on the lessons learned from promoting research in my previous office and the similar consulting I did for other firms, which informed a lot of my perspective on how to define and support research. So prior to joining Placetailor in 2018, I did a long stint at Sasaki, which over the last decade has produced a fantastic body of research. While there, I worked closely with Mr. Brad Prespo, who moderated earlier, and a number of others, and contributed not only to research directly, but also a wide range of efforts to formalize and better support that research. And at the time, I led the sustainability group there. I was president of the Sasaki Foundation and was working across the disciplines to incorporate more coordinated research agenda. So as part of that effort, I introduced them to the R&D tax credits. The result was pretty substantial and valuable. So I wanted to take a minute to give you a very brief introduction to it and promote its use. The tax credits are designed to advance the technological standing of the US, right? So it's something that other industries have utilized well for decades, and only now is it becoming more common in the design fields, in part because of the advancing technical nature of our work. So the most boiled down way to understand what qualifies is the four-part test. Are you working towards something that is new to your firm, not the industry, to your firm? Are you utilizing a systematic approach to testing? Are you reaching conclusions? And is it of a technological nature? So what the R&D tax credits underscored for us is the benefit of properly defining what flavor of research you're trying to do and how it should be approached and or funded in a potentially different way, in a more beneficial way. I provided a framework for categorizing the intellectual property, putting the work through the appropriate funding channels, and thereby optimizing the financial or tax benefits of the work. You see here a very simple decision-making tree, which you can apply to any research interest. If IP is being generated that the firm wants to keep private or wants to directly apply to the projects, or if they want to use it for marketing purposes, those are corporate outputs. If that research utilizes soft science, it falls into a subcategory of that. If that research utilizes the hard sciences, it's tracked differently and will be tested against the R&D credit criteria, potentially to a significant dollar savings come tax time. If the IP is for the public domain, for public good, for public use, then it can be performed for or with nonprofit vehicles. So that's a whole other conversation, but this is just a sort of snapshot of how we began to approach things. And providing clear categories to the efforts not only gave us clarity in how to fund it, but also gave the staff a better understanding of how to approach their research project and process. So a little bit like how Kimberly was saying, is it big R, little r? Designers getting their head around what research means is something we're still working on. So with that understanding, I helped a number of other companies. I consulted for a handful of other design and engineering firms and even a few product manufacturers. I connected the firms with the better tax consultants that I knew to be experts in that unique realm. And I worked with their leadership to tailor their support structure to foster the company's unique cultural needs and aspirations, which is not the same for every firm. It's almost never the same for any firm. So with that, a few years ago, I joined Placetailor as a strategic director. And I was highly intrigued by the opportunity to apply my previous experience in developing these research encouraging strategies to a company that was so thoroughly driven by practice research at its core. So Placetailor is a vertically integrated cooperative. It's offering development, architecture, and construction services. It is completely mission driven. It is 100% focused on transforming the housing industry and decarbonizing every aspect of what we do, and providing replicable models and strategies for others to follow. If we can solve Boston, we can save the world. Placetailor is able to achieve we're one of the few firms that are currently exceeding the AIA 2030 energy reduction targets across our entire portfolio. In fact, we've not designed or built anything since 2008 that has not exceeded that standard and been to a passive house or net positive energy level. And we can do all that because project-based research is absolutely at our core. We maintain this by having a complete commitment to our mission, clear mission. Therefore, our model has evolved in order to meet that mission rather than our mission being watered down to fit into a static preconceived model. The model evolved in order to generate and capture the value that we're creating. We have a clear master plan for what we need to prove through our R&D. And with that plan in mind, we prove some element of that on every single project. Every one is an opportunity. And all of that contributes to and is driven by a culture of not just thought leadership, but do leadership. We're constantly reminding each other of that. All 25 people in the organization are doers. So I'll quickly share with you just a few examples before leaving of our R&D efforts. We refer to our stick-built work as Model A. Over the years, we've tested every version of passive house level construction, and we know intimately the associated construction costs and issues and performance. Model B refers to any prefabricated panel systems. So over the last few years, we've worked closely with a few manufacturers, and in one of those cases, helped them redesign and standardize their design and delivery process to help them increase the output and decrease costs and schedule. Model C is the new territory of cross-laminated timber, which we're very excited about because of the embodied carbon benefits. So we're currently working on what will be the first complete CLT building in Boston. It's a mixed-use project, market rate housing, affordable commercial space. And we're doing that with design partners Generate Architecture and Technologies, which is a startup out of the MIT Mass Timber Lab. So we're marrying their ongoing research with our drive to do. We're dedicated to addressing the existing building stock, which is a whole can of worms. And so right now we're working hard on a prefab retrofit panel system designed for use on Boston's ubiquitous triple-decker typology. And finally, we've begun providing service, research for service. It's not a big part of what we're doing, but it's a fun part. So we're working with manufacturers to provide our integrated value analysis on the energy design, constructability, and all of the overall impacts to the bottom line development pro formas. And all of that institutional knowledge has been applied to a recent Boston Department of Neighborhood Development ZEBS guidebook. So we developed the new requirements for all affordable housing in Boston to be zero emissions buildings. We included in that guidebook quite a bit of the resources and lessons learned from the last decade. So you can download that from boston.gov website if you like. And in closing, one more time, it is imperative that the brain trust that is architecture, and especially here in Boston, expand its research. And so I encourage you all to do that and do it collaboratively and to join the movement.
Thank you, Colin. So now I'm going to ask the panelists to unmute themselves, and we're going to start a little discussion. And again, I want to encourage everyone to post any questions that you have in the Q&A. I see that's kind of started, and we'll get to those throughout the discussion part of our program. I think there was some commonalities of what were discussed. I want to start with firm culture. That came up consistently throughout your presentations, but in some sort of different ways. And specifically, we had a question earlier about how do I get started and how do I kind of get moving on this if I'm sort of new to it. And then of course we have people on the line who've been doing research for a while in their practices. So how do we go, so talk through the business plan and the sort of strategic plan aspect. Was that an important part for you as you defined your culture? And how did that kind of come to being, and what are some key elements of those plans? Why don't we start with Colin? You were the last to talk, so I'll put you first up for the discussion. And you kind of touched on this a little bit, but why don't you get us started in terms of the business plan, the strategic plan? Is that important for you? How did you structure it?
Sure. So where I've been for the last 3 years is a bit of a unique case because I got to walk into the clear focus and build operational support around it, which is much easier in that direction. It's already bubbling up all over. How do we build our strategic plan? We're just all in, and we constantly remind each other of that, and then it finds its way into every conversation that we're having. Solving the city and then solving the world is something that we treat as inevitable because it has to happen. So everything we're doing is oriented to to working backward from that starting point. We're all artists and activists, and we're pretty unapologetic about that mission, and why not? So for us, it is the brand and the spirit. So it drives all of the business planning after that.
Billy, why don't you follow up on that?
Yeah, I'd love to
Sort
follow
of
up on that.
similar.
So I think one thing, there's a couple of things I can offer. First, research is integral to our design philosophy, and James Timberlake and Steve Kieran are designers who have question asking and are questioning and integrated into their posture towards design. So 36 years, this has been an evolving model of research. The firm has always taken on proactive projects that would benefit certain outcomes within the industry. But in terms of strategic planning, I think it's really interesting to note in the history of our firm that in 2001, we were the inaugural recipients of the Latrobe Prize. And so something really small like that, that's really huge for the AIA, can also help a firm reorganize and come up with yet another generation of what research looks like in practice. And that's exactly what happened. So I encourage firms to go after those types of initiatives, because in our case, that the Latrobe Prize, which resulted in refabricating architecture, also resulted in an internal move, which was a new strategic plan that reorganized the entire firm around searching and searching again, or research. And since then, that strategic plan, we do strategic planning every 3 to 5 years, but that strategic plan has always integrated research. And so it also made the commitment to reinvest roughly 10% of our profit back into proactive work. So yeah, it's integrated into the strategic plan. It's there, it continues to be there, and it continues to evolve.
I'm excited that our new strategic plan has research as a tenet in order to meet our imperatives. So yeah, I get that. It's exciting. Kimberly, why don't you sort of talk? I mean, Perkins and Will is at a different scale than almost all firms. So, and if you really want to know this, you can see kind of how you guys shake out with like kind of the other half dozen that are in your scale. So how does that kind of come to be, right? So people can't necessarily do it at that level, but studio by studio, how does that get infused into sort of your business planning and strategic plan?
Yeah, it's a great question, and there's a lot of different ways to answer it. So it's intentional and it's integral into our strategic planning, both on a firm-wide level and on a studio-by-studio basis. You know, there's an allocated budget per studio for research activities, and then there's an allocated firm-wide budget for set activities as well. But what's interesting, kind of sort of similar to what Colin was saying, you know, when he joined Placetailor, there was already a structure in place. I joined Perkins and Will 3 years ago, and there was a structure in place. But even in the 3 years that I've been at Perkins and Will, we've gotten better at formalizing the process. And every year, like what Billy just said, it's an evolution. So we're getting better at refining what it means to not only allocate funding, but how to distribute it most efficiently, and how to ensure that we're actually achieving what our goal is, which is practice-based research for research-based practice. So, and I would also add, you know, our research initiative, research has always been a part of the culture. It started to get the beginnings of a formalized process with the advent of the research journal 12 years ago. And with every year since, there's components of that ecosystem that have made it more structured, and that structure has actually allowed us to flourish. So it's dynamic, to say the least. Yeah.
I'm gonna move to another topic which aligns with one of the questions that's come in through the chat as well, and that's around value. And there's two ways I think that we want to explore this. So first is the agency of the architect that came up throughout the presentations as well as a common thread. So we'll start there, but then the next is kind of around these metrics, right? What metrics do you track to show that you're achieving that value that you've perceived? So let's start on the agency question. And then I want to switch to some of these sort of mechanisms of ROI and how you define that value and set those measures. Do you want any takers to go first, or do you want me to pick? Billie.
Michelle, you know, I don't know. I think this is a really, really important question, the value question. I think there's multiple ways that we could answer it, both personally from the perspective of our firms, but more broadly, I know that there's a very important discourse that's happening inside our profession about us taking on the role of being knowledge producers. So why would we want to do that is the big question. Another question that comes along with that is, does that mean we're increasing our risk, right? And I know that was talked about earlier. But when you're a knowledge producer, I think what it suggests and what it hypothesizes is that we can be in the position to understand the outcomes that are associated with our design agency. And if we can put ourselves in those positions, then we should be able to actually learn from and begin to create very robust feedback loops between our actions, our outcomes, and our continued action. Furthermore, we can also begin to take on the grand challenges within the built environment. There is pressing need for research in the built environment. We all know that. Like I'm sure this has already been discussed, but we all know that. So why not us taking on that agency to understand what we've created, take responsibility for it, and also begin to really create more valuable environments that work towards a whole range of different outcomes. And I know we could all I would love to whiteboard this with the entire audience that's out there. There's so many outcomes we care about. So many.
Colin, building on that.
So I just recorded Billie. I'm going to play it back for you again. Yeah, all of that. Agency, yeah. I mean, we have the beautifully arrogant attitude, intentionally arrogant, of if we're hitting a barrier, we have to break through it or go around it. You know, this company started as mostly build, staffed with architects, you know, young designers, and we got into development because we just didn't want to have to be held back waiting for the right projects where we wanted to do something. We needed to own it and control it. And that's proved very valuable. So to the ROI question, the overall value of what we're creating often, our company is creating, often lands in the final bottom line of when a property is sold. So you know, that's where the entire pro forma gets balanced out and the equation is completed. So from that perspective, it's easy to value it, right? Is there a strong market for what we're offering? So far, the answer has been a resounding yes, right? So all of this talk about, oh my God, it might take 1% to 2% more to build passive house level housing, whatever. The market rate sales that we've done, much of what we do is affordable, but in there is some market rate sales. They have been consistently 8 to 28% above market comps, right? So who cares about the 1% to 2%? There is a screaming market that wants value aligned housing that reflects their desire to live a carbon neutral life and have the ability to do that. And they want something that facilitates that. So getting into the, it's not hard for us to say, yes, there's value in pushing this because we get to capture some of that. We get to see some of that come back to us, or we get to use that as a talking point when we're working with other clients. So all of the reinvestment that we make, there's never a question of if it has value.
Kimberly, so non-residential, your sphere to track. What about you guys? What is your view of both agency, which you already touched on quite a bit, but also those metrics and ROI?
Yeah, I feel like I have like the easiest seat here because I've been the last speaker of both rounds. So
I know, I'm gonna, don't worry, don't worry.
Which
Don't
is
worry,
great,
we'll get to it.
I'm like, yes. But I think the concept of agency, right, being agents for change or driving this is a really important one. And for us at Perkins and Will, a lot of it, and I did kind of touch on this, a driver for us for research is just understand how we can enhance almost like the triple bottom line of the built environment, right? The experiential, the environmental, and then economic performance benefits of our built environment. And the best way to actually evaluate if you're doing that is to conduct research. And so that for us is part of this imperative for us, is making sure we're doing that. And then in terms of the return on our investment, it's a bit intangible, right? It's a little bit difficult to calculate the return on your investment. Sure, there are metrics you can actually do to understand your actual research benefits, but in terms of talent retention, overall, I think energetic culture, engagement, I think when people are passionate about where they're working, that's like an invaluable metric, but how do you measure that? And so it's a tricky one, right? Like your ROI, I think it's a lot easier if like, yes, we had like what Colin was talking about with R&D tax credits, if we could have like this actual return on what we got and we did, but it's a little bit more tricky, I would say, and complex to distill out those numbers exactly for our value. So we just know it's valuable.
Michelle, that's not gonna, I mean, like, I wonder, we can't quite distill down those numbers or talk about ROI so directly. And I wonder if that just sort of points out part of the approach. And we saw these approaches with other presenters, which is building a culture of inquiry. It means actually investing. What are we investing in? So we're investing in people who can dedicate their time. We're investing in actual infrastructure. We saw that earlier from the tools that we bring in to the methods we use to share knowledge, right? So there are actual investments that we're making in firm infrastructure, but there's a larger investment, I think, that we're talking about, which is taking the time to build research culture so that we can ensure that questioning will thrive within all of our projects. So it's an interesting proposition. I mean, at KieranTimberlake, it's integrated into our practice. We can't separate it out. It's not a profit center. I can't put it aside and say, that's how much money we got back. It's not like that. It is actually building culture. And so it's integral. It's not separated. Not a satisfying answer, maybe. I don't know.
Oh, it's an interesting. Kimberly, go.
I was just going to say it's the same thing, right? Like it's difficult to determine that exact return on your investment with your people and also with direct relationships to your clients. Like I think there's a disconnect there as well, but it would be an equally valuable metric that we just can't answer.
Yeah, no, that's true. We saw this earlier with firms and other firms who have other models, and I think that's what's actually so helpful with this conference is we're seeing all these different models of practice.
So let's get to money, right? We touched on it, so let's talk about it.
Okay.
So there's a question about how you budget for it. Colin talked about the tax credits. You've talked about reinvesting profits.
Yep.
We've talked about these set-aside funds. So again, because it looks different everywhere a little bit. So on the money side, there's, let's start with external funding. So what are those challenges of seeking that funding? And when are there things to be mindful of in approaching R&D and tax credit? Do you need infrastructure in place to do that? Do you need experts? Like, what are some of the paths to that? So let's start on external. And Kimberly, you know, you asked for it, so let's start with you on this one.
All right, I did ask for it.
You did.
So, thanks for delivering, Michelle. That's great. With external funding opportunities, for us, a firm of our size, there's a variety of, I think, avenues for us to pursue, right? So we have our 501c3, we have our nonprofit arm, which allows us a little bit more opportunity than I think some other smaller firms that might not have the advantage of having a nonprofit arm. And that opens up a variety of government funding, nonprofit funding sources, you know, not to say that they are easy to get, because they're not, but it's still, it allows a funding source if we are able to receive that. And then another one is recognizing how clients can partner with us to pay for it. You know, that still is being worked out. If there was a silver bullet for that, I think, you know, our industry would be in a better shape. But that kind of goes back to what we've been saying is like our industry needs more money. We recognize this as a real issue. New research needs to be done. We haven't figured it out, and we certainly need more money. So in the absence of a lot of these external sources, which, you know, maybe after today, all of a sudden there'll be like just an onslaught of available funding sources. But in the absence of that, you know, figuring out how we can best utilize part of our profits to reinvest internally and then continue this research effort is how we've been pursuing it so far. And then the R&D tax credits, I know that we do have an effort internally with some of our projects, but our accountants usually look at that, and it's quite frankly not a big part of what we do, I would say, but it is something that we pay attention to. So,
Colin, why don't you pick up on the tax credit piece? That's a part of your journey and work. So why don't you sort of shed a little bit more clarity on that?
Yeah. Starting with the tax credits, I just encourage everybody to, you know, find a good consultant and just see if it's possible for you. If it is, there's certain things that will keep you from doing it, but if it is possible for you, start now. You can start safe, start small, but start now. Get used to it, figure it out, and do it. It can really be a substantial amount of money, and you can. If you're promoting it in your office and you're bringing it to the boss, tell the boss that, you know, if it's successful, they'll reinvest that saved money back into the research program. That's something I often encourage. Other than that, it's a bit opaque, and you need a good expert to help you guide you through it, the specifics of it. And then there's a lot you can do to sort of optimize the tracking, identifying the tracking of it, in anticipation of that sort of annual review, which makes their job a lot easier and more productive. So that's that. Go do it. I want to outline sort of our specific approach to outside funding. Not that it's obviously the same for others, but I think there might be something in there for folks who are thinking creatively. Our outside funding ends up coming through our investors in our real estate projects and our acquisitions and our equity partners or otherwise investors. We've been attracting a lot of impact investors, some of whom want a good return, some of whom don't want a good return. They want to know that their money's going toward positive change. And so, you know, the CLT project is not the only one, but it's a good example. We're using CLT on a project that's a little bit smaller than we normally should, because it's not really competing directly with steel and concrete like it should. It's going to be a more expensive building. The equity partners aren't going to make much or maybe any money on it, but it's invaluable project research. And so we just went and found people that were okay with that. And saying, hey, we're going to charge a typical architecture fee plus slight bits extra because this is a new thing. We need to learn these lessons. It's going to be good for the industry and the world. People are out there who want to fund it. So Not that those same funding sources are necessarily going to just give a check directly to an architecture firm, but maybe, and also maybe you show them the projects that that they can do with you. You know, get creative about what you're doing with them. You can initiate projects without having to put up capital or be the developer. You can just help get them started. Good architects have always been doing that. So give that a shot.
Billie, I think people have a perception about KieranTimberlake because of Tally and some of the other tools that you put out, that's a profit center for you and you fund your research off of that. So we know we've talked about a little myth busting there, but that is a role of who you are, right? Your identity. And there are other firms that look at materials and tool development. So a little bit about like why that's your a little bit of your rep. But how do you guys look at that part, right? The experimentation, almost.
Well, I think it's important to recognize. Sorry, I didn't.
No, the product development part, right?
Yeah, the product development part. I think it's important to recognize, as Christopher said, that Tally began as a piece of advocacy, and I'm just noticing a question in the Q&A about these kinds of projects and what are their goals or outcomes, right? And so we knew that we needed a platform to distribute Tally. And we also knew that it's not our core business to be software developers. And so KT Innovations is there so that we can take any of the concepts that we prove through KT Research, which is our research infrastructure inside KieranTimberlake, and basically distribute any of the proof of concepts that we bring through a commercialization process. We can distribute them through KT Innovations. It does give us a firewall between those two entities, and just recognizes that these are different core competencies and different core business models. But I also think that you move projects from one place to the other because you believe they have value, and they have value for, they would have value for many, many, many people, right? So that's part of the impetus for KT Innovations. Did I answer your question?
You did. You definitely did. I want to take a question from the chat that's an extension to this discussion, and it's about relationships with academic partners. Do those relationships support the budget by paying for principals or vice versa? Are those formal relationships informal, and where are they in the sort of budget resource game? Because it can be about people too. Kimberly, why don't you go first on that?
Sure, yeah. So our academic partnerships is an interesting question because I would say it's the reverse. It's not that the funding goes and pays to our principals. It's more about our firm's dedication to partnering with the academic institution, and therefore it creates a channel for us to get involved and be the architectural and urban design firm that's informing some of the academic research that's happening at that site. So the dynamic that's, the question implies a dynamic that I don't think actually is true for how we pursue academic partnerships. Maybe Billie or Colin have a different experience.
The same is exactly true for us. I mean, our academic partnerships are ones that are founded on very clear projects where they really want to or need to partner with a firm. It's firm-based research, and there's no, let's say, direct sort of payment. It's not, again, I don't think it's a very robust funding model. And then I think this gets back to this other question we didn't take up from you, which is, where are all the grants for research in practice? Where are they? And how do we continue to represent ourselves and our expertise to entities like the NSF and DOE and others that have a track record of actually putting out calls that address many, many challenges, right? So
oh my gosh, I'm doing I did what I didn't say I would do. I'm talking over one of you. I apologize for that.
That's okay.
I want to take that because it reminds me of a stat that I showed earlier, which is 1% of federal research dollars goes to our industry, and most of that's engineering, but 18% goes to healthcare. But the built environment is entwined in healthcare. And so that, you know, the seat at the table, right? Like and there are some really folks that are sitting at those tables, and we are working with schools of public health as well through our Design and Health Research Consortium. But there is there's an element of understanding, I think, what an architect can bring on the research side that maybe isn't historically known in terms of the profession's not seen in that same way. Similarly, a lot of the resilience grants are very oriented. There's a lot of language around engineers, and we've worked quite a bit to expand that. So it's not specifically worded that only engineers can get dollars to do safety assessment programs and so on. But anything on that particular point, and then I really want to get to another question in the chat, but I just want to kind of just follow on the government piece that you started, Billie. So can you continue on that?
You want me to continue?
Yeah, I do.
I'm wondering if Colin or Kimberly, if you've had experience with any of these grant infrastructures.
Sure.
I'll jump in. No, not yet. We are starting to put our gaze to them. We've been involved with academia, but it's always been networking, access to talent, recruiting, passion and energy, kind of contributing to the community, things like that. It's not at all been for funding sources. I don't know that strictly academic grants are anything that we're going to be pursuing anytime soon, as much as I'd like to. But I will just say we're keeping our fingers crossed for a real blue wave for, among other reasons, promises of a lot of money going into the built environment, which, for those of us who are trying to address energy and health and overall quality and value of the built environment, as you put it before, Billie, God, I hope some of that comes all of our way, and we can really put it to good use.
Well, if folks who are listening haven't read it, I think a really great model of a grant would be one that went through a cycle last year, which is the DOE's Advanced Building and Construction, or ABC grant. And that grant was targeting innovations within our industry. And it was purposefully devised to result in academic and practice-based and industry-based partnerships, where you had to have true representation across the entire supply/value chain. And it's a really great example of a funding stream, funding vision for our industry. And I would encourage folks, if you haven't read it, go back out and read it, because I think it also could be extended as a conversation about certain areas within the industry that we need more research on.
I know anecdotally.
Sorry, Kimberly. Go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to add just real quick to that conversation. I think anecdotally, I've seen our designers in our firm and within our industry, really, the DOE has been a good resource for potential grants, at least government grant funding, definitely. And I've also seen a couple statewide opportunities. I just moved to Massachusetts from California, and so I'm more familiar with California, but there's several grant funding opportunities for our industry there. But I think, ironically, and Billie, you mentioned NSF. Historically, I think the NSF they're not big fans of architects. Like, for whatever reason, I think that it's really difficult to, if you're an architect on a grant application, it's like you better hope that the team that you're on actually has like an in. But maybe that's just my experience, and maybe others in the audience had a more positive experience with NSF grant funding. So, yeah.
I want to I do want to pick up on that thread of collaboration and interdisciplinary relationships to end with, but first I think there's a really great question in the chat, which is about applying your research skills towards equity in the profession and through increased collaboration with occupants now and future occupants in neighborhoods. So this came up on a live webinar that we held earlier this week, but it feels like weeks ago. And in other discussions around equity. And a lot of the discussions today have been building science related or around tools and materials. And so what do you say to that? Kimberly, you had an answer in the chat, so why don't I let you bring that out? And then Colin, I'll go to you because you've talked about being an activist several times. So let's make that circle. Go ahead, Kimberly.
Absolutely. So I alluded to this in the answer in the chat, but a couple of years ago, our discussions around equity really started to crystallize. There were a couple of designers in our Seattle and Los Angeles studios that were very, I would say, aware of the issue that we needed to be paying more attention to issues of equity within, not only within our design teams, but also the communities with which we were operating in. And so one of our innovation incubator grantees now 3 years ago in Seattle, he'd done, I think, extensive research on what resources existed within the city of Seattle and the state of Washington to create a toolkit, which was a 4-part series just to walk you through the questions of what you should be considering. Because the concept of equity is, we all have biases. And so getting out of our biased heads and our design spaces and trying to just envision what it would be like to understand the community you're operating in is a really difficult thing. And it's a very uncomfortable conversation. And so he created a toolkit, which then was distributed widely to our firm. And then building on that, there's been a couple subsequent innovation incubator grants that have built upon that to enhance the resources for our firm, but then also they're available for public consumption on our website. So yeah, that is a part of the conversation that we've been tackling, and I think we all still have work to do as evidenced by this year, but yes. Yeah.
And then again, Colin, I want to pivot over to you. Housing, of course, has a lot of inequality built into its history. So is that part of your research ethos? And kind of also, how does equity play in what you guys are doing?
Yeah, so we do a bit of projects all around, but the majority of them are in Roxbury and Dorchester, neighborhoods of Boston, which are underserved communities. It's got to be half of our projects are in the Fort Hill neighborhood and thereabouts, and so we're where a number of us live. So we're deeply entrenched in the neighborhoods that we're investing in, and as pretty key to our process is engaging the neighborhood before we think we know what we might want to build, making sure we're giving them what they need collectively, and so that's been a very positive feedback loop for us, because they tend to believe us, they know us and believe us. What we say we're going to do, we do, and we're doing a better product. Along with that, we're a cooperative, right? So we very intentionally say, if we can't hire people from the neighborhoods we're working in, train them to build sustainable housing, and then give them a wage that they can use to buy the house that they're building at a rate they can afford, we're doing something wrong. And so we've been doing that. We continue to be able to do that. So that's a pretty, and then we give them ownership as a co-op, right? So after a few years, they're eligible for co-ownership. So equity in neighborhoods we work in is absolutely crucial to what we're doing. And now what we're working on is the frontier of how to turn that social equity into financial equity on all the projects. So finding the banks, the impact investment groups and the progressive banks to actually front at no risk the equity for people in the immediate area of the developments that we're doing. So yeah, equity all day. There's no sustainability without equity, and it's amazingly intertwined. And yes.
Michelle, can I jump in to answer this question?
Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah, when we talk about outcomes we should be, I mean, one of the chief reasons to do practice-based research and understand outcomes is to understand whether or not you're building equitable outcomes. And I think that this wave of practice-based research really needs to tackle that question. We want to know the results of the things that we put into the environment as designers. We specifically at KieranTimberlake have worked on a number of projects because a lot of our research is project-based, partnership-based. And so partnerships we've had with entities like Jefferson University's Health Design Lab have worked on projects that, for instance, CoLab is a retrofit of an Airstream trailer that began first with reaching out to community leaders where there were intense health inequities in a community here in Philadelphia, and really working with those community leaders to listen to what they needed and to hear from them exactly how they wanted to use certain resources. And then part of the research was just simply trying to understand whether or not we have met their needs and trying to continue to adjust what is being done with the resources that they have in their environment and their neighborhoods. The other big challenge, we have talked a lot about embodied carbon, and I know this was the former, or this was one of the BSA's conferences was on embodied carbon. We participated in it. It's absolutely an impact, an environmental impact. We're talking about something at the global scale, and we've proven that we have the agency right when we're designing to tackle carbon and to tackle climate mitigation. But when we also look at life cycle assessment, there's all these other impact categories that we can talk about, like acidification potential and eutrophication potential. Those are actually local impacts. So another thing we have to do, we might be tackling global warming potential, and it's a global thing we're talking about. But then there's the actual local impacts that are associated with our design decisions. Those have to be tackled too, in a big way. Yeah.
So we have about 10 minutes left before I'll ask you to do your, big closings in 1 minute. But I want to get to the point about collaboration and interdisciplinary relationships. And there's a question on this again about, do you need those to kind of de-risk your application of research? And we talked about that earlier, sort of decoupling research probably from a particular client that came up in the panel on risk. But so how do we, so one, let's start with kind of that piece of it. So external funding sources, removing some of the risk and partnerships to do that. And then I want to kind of talk about the product. And we have a poll on risk. So how risk averse do you kind of feel you are in your practice? I'll let people answer that poll, but let's start the discussion. And Billie, why don't you start on this one?
So can you repeat the question, Michelle?
Sure. Two things. One is bringing in outside funding and partners.
Yes.
I would say remove risk from the process,
Yeah.
And then leveraging those relationships.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't say that we bring in outside, I wouldn't say I can correlate bringing in outside partners with risk per se. So if I could take on collaboration, I just gave an example of collaboration, but in that instance, we're working directly with doctors. And part of the need to bring on collaborators is because we simply don't have the knowledge or skill sets. What we found, and you know this about our practice, I think Christopher may have said this earlier, is that we are purposefully a transdisciplinary practice, and we've built our research practice by bringing in folks with backgrounds in the traditionally unallied disciplines. So these are folks that have backgrounds in things like environmental management or urban ecology or physics or other things like mathematics, these things. So these are folks that have other skills and other methods, and those collaborations are incredibly important. But even within our own transdisciplinary practice, we find that our questions tend to look at the gaps in the profession or search for those gaps in knowledge. And those gaps in knowledge are big, and there's nothing better than reaching out and trying to really work alongside others who have these methods. Collaboration is essential. I can't make the association to de-risking with collaboration.
So the emphasizing shake of head. So Colin, let's switch to you. And continuing on that point, relationships, collaborations, and then since you were agreeing with it's not correlated with risk, but why don't we talk a little bit about the collaborations and relationships you have to do this work?
So, so we've been in a process for the last few years. I mean, since I arrived, I came from, coming from Sasaki, highly collaborative. It was like being in a university with all the, all the great minds coming in and out of there. And so then I came to this other firm that had been in a cocoon very intentionally of, we're gonna take all of it and figure out all of the pain points and figure out a better way around it, right? So that everything from hammering the nails to selling the property at the end, just everything, and which has all of the risk. And then since I've been here, it's been a lot of the restructuring and everything has been about turning all of that outward, so that while we're still doing about half of our work internally, the other half is with is for other clients, collaborating with other people. And so we very intentionally said, we don't have all the answers, but we have some really key answers that we really want to share with you, and we want to get out there. And so we can work with anyone in some capacity. If you have an interest in doing low carbon buildings, we might be able to help you in whatever way. So many ways we can collaborate. So that's been really fun and really valuable, because it's an easy thing to get passionate about and have fun selling. Maybe we're sharing more risk than we used to, but we're also doing riskier work. So I think we see the risk in not working hard enough to stem some of the issues that are coming our way. That's the risk in our minds. So we're doing everything we can do as safely as we can, but it's all hands on deck to push through. So risk is often not a consideration.
Kimberly, I want to ask one kind of final question on partners, but I want to pivot to product manufacturers and what does that look like? So there's different mindsets about bringing private dollars and manufacturers to the table to help us with these questions. So what's your point of view on the role of product manufacturers and them funding and getting engaged in research efforts?
I vaguely remember Colin having an interesting answer to something similar to that. We were having the pre-discussion a couple weeks ago, but we have our own kind of answer to that in Perkins and Will. And I think it's really important to have relationships with product manufacturers. I mean, we're all part of the same industry. We're working together. It's imperative that we understand what are the drivers from an architectural side and what's happening from the manufacturer side. But I think if manufacturers are funding the research that you're doing, is there, an inherent conflict? It could be something to bring up. I think partnerships with manufacturers is definitely going to be, I think, something that we explore more in the future. I think that we have to change our nature and how we have to shift the paradigm of how we're working. So I don't really have a clear answer for what you're asking, Michelle. But maybe I'll get motivated to answer more directly if when I hear from Billie and Colin. Yeah.
So let's go in that order. Go ahead, Colin. Yeah, and then Billie follow.
So yeah, so I mentioned in the presentation that we've started doing a bit of taking some of that money from the manufacturers. It's not much, but it's been really interesting. And I agree, it can lead to a conflict of interest. So here's how we've been approaching it. They know us, they know what we're all about, and they know that if we're using their product, it's because we believe in its performance, and again, because we hold the risk that's gonna perform in terms of our liabilities and such. So what we've been doing is saying, and I can't tell you all of who they are, but we will say to them, we're going to do an analysis of your product because we're interested in using it, first and foremost. We're going to do an analysis of your project that would determine whether or not we would want to use it. And we will tell you why we would or why we wouldn't. So if we apply our integrated thinking, we're able to give them feedback that I think is pretty unique to a lot of manufacturers, because they're, sometimes you can't make the argument from just one industry perspective. You really need to look at all of the trade-offs across the delivery chain. So something might be easier to install with or have better performance, but is there a trade-off in how it is to design with it or get access to the product, or timetables or bottom line. So we've been doing this sort of like, you pay us a little bit to justify our time to put our team to it, and we'll tell you if we're interested or not in using it. And if we are, then it's not about, then you can tell people that we want to use it, but you are not paying us to use it. You're paying us to test it and potentially reject it.
Billie, do you have a final thought on that?
Yeah, I do. I think something we can recognize within our building culture is that relationships with not only product manufacturers, but raw material producers and the entire supply chain is incredibly important. And to actually understand that entire chain of relationships is incredibly important. I think if you step back and we start to look at sources for innovation in our industry, we can begin to realize that there's always shifts and transformations between incredibly fundamental variables. So if I'm going to quote someone here, it would be James Marston Fitch, who I quote quite a bit, but it's so appropriate. We can look at, and paraphrasing, the relationship between materials, theories, and techniques. And he talks about these three things being dynamic. And when there's a change in one, there's ultimately a change in another and another. And there's these great examples of sources of innovation within the built environment that come from radical changes in one changing the other. So right now, one of the biggest sources of innovation is the need to actually rethink the supply for materials because of carbon. So we have this incredible movement happening in the manufacturing industry to address embodied carbon, which means that if you look deeply at what manufacturers are doing, they are trying to optimize material ingredients to remove chemicals of concern, to decrease global warming potential, and to address those local impacts, right? Which means that they're also needing to actually talk to many parts of that supply chain, including us. I also think this has always been incredible. These relationships have always been an incredible source of inspiration for architectural innovation. And we should continue to pursue them. That doesn't really answer your question.
No, it absolutely does.
Does it? Okay.
And we're like 1 minute to the end. So I do want to be mindful of time for our audience who's pretty much stuck with us, which is great, on the East Coast. So you have one sentence to talk about your call to action, maybe 2 sentences, but kind of a tweet-sized a note to end this discussion. So a call to action, something within the industry, something beyond the industry. What's a final thought you'd like to leave the audience with? And anyone can go first. I'll let you jump in. Or I'll pick. Colin, you go first.
All right. I don't have anything prepared. Okay. I'll just say commitment to a mission will be a valuable investment. And so pick a mission, commit to it fully, and find the people out there who are doing it and want to help you along and want to collaborate with you to do it. And I encourage you to do that. We all need it.
Billie.
Well, I think I'm going to have to probably go to the this big question that we've debated before, Michelle, which has to do with what do you really need to do research? And when you step back and you ask yourselves, what do you really need? Do you need money? Do you need tools? Or do you need culture? And the way we answer that question might tell us a lot about where we are right now in our research practices. So the question is, without blank, research will not thrive at my firm. Without money, culture, tools, research will not thrive at my firm. So where are you is the big question. And I can tell you for us, the answer is without research culture, research will not thrive at KieranTimberlake.
And that actually has been something consistent that we found in the firms that we've modeled as well. Everything else changes, tools, money, there's
tools and money change.
Culture is at the heart of all of it. Kimberly, you get to be the final, the mic down.
No pressure there. I guess so, kind of building on Colin and Billie just said, I'd say then ask yourselves, why are you doing the research? And if the answer is because you're trying to transform our industry, then my next kind of directive or action would say, look for the partners, look for the right people that you think could help move your research along. That's really
awesome. It. I love that. I love that. Well, I want to thank you all for joining us today and closing us out. I know it's late. And I really want to thank our sponsors and all of you who stuck with us to the bitter end. There was hardly any drop-offs, which is always rough for a session on the East Coast that ends after hours. And while this is the last session of our conference, the dialogues are not stopping today. So we want you to keep an eye out for more on research and practice from the BSA, and don't hesitate to reach out with them with your ideas, questions, challenges, successes on this topic. I know they're continuing to try to evolve and keep on top of these conversations, and we're excited that they're doing that at the national level so we can partner as well. I want to give a thanks to Natasha Espinato, who's the head of the president of BSA right now, their board, Eric White and Billy Craig in the staff leadership, and Caitlin Hart, who worked with all of us speakers and personally as well to help support us through this journey. So I know the staff is always behind the scenes. I want to thank them. Final thought, together we can continue to define the value proposition for research and practice and research and architect broadly, broaden and deepen the agency of architects and design professionals to create better outcomes. I talk about agency a whole lot too. So I think that that's a great thought to leave on as well. So more to come from BSA, keep an eye out for that. Again, all of these recorded sessions are available through the end of the year for those that you've signed up for. And again, thank you and have a great night.